This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Today, the Orthodox Conundrum is releasing a new episode of Intimate Judaism that my Intimate Judaism co-host Talli Rosenbaum and I recorded with Yonina Rubinstein, where we explore how parents can approach conversations about sexuality with sensitivity, clarity, and confidence. How shall we talk to kids about sex in a way that's honest, healthy, and grounded in Jewish values? Yonina offers practical strategies for different ages and stages, explains the importance of modeling a positive attitude towards intimacy, and talks about how halacha and tradition can serve as a guide, not a barrier, to raising sexually healthy children. Whether you're a parent, educator, or you're just thinking ahead, this episode offers an essential roadmap for both navigating and redefining the talk in a way that's open and deeply rooted in Jewish life. I believe that this episode is quite important, and it's being released simultaneously on Intimate Judaism and the Orthodox Conundrum. Please note that it discusses sensitive topics and uses explicit language, so listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn, and today we're going to be speaking about a very important and perhaps sensitive topic. That is, how should you speak to your children about sex and topics regarding and involving intimacy? And in order to do so, we'll be speaking with our guest, Yonina Rubinstein. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment as well. Make sure to tell people about Intimate Judaism so that we can continue to grow our audience. Let me introduce Yonina right now. Yonina Rubinstein is a certified sexuality educator and group facilitator. She heads the sexuality department at Be'er Emunah Institute in Jerusalem. She teaches adults and teens, as well as parents and educational staff, all about healthy sexuality. Yonina is the author of the internationally acclaimed book, Sexuality After Childbirth, and When Kids Don't Speak, and runs the highly popular course, Growing Together, Raising Sexually Healthy Children. And she's the founder of the Facebook community, Jewish Parents Raising Sexually Healthy Kids and Teens. Yonina, welcome to Intimate Judaism.
Thank you so much for having me.
We want to jump right into our conversation today. We're going to be speaking about specific topics and how to talk to kids about this. But before we do so, I'd like to first talk about the importance of parents talking to kids about sexuality and intimacy. I'm guessing there are many parents who hope they can rely on their kids' schools or other people to have the talk. I'm assuming you don't agree with that. Could you talk about why it's important for parents to talk about these topics and creating a culture where such conversations are possible?
Yes. Okay. So I love the way you framed the question. It really brings up a lot. So first of all, a lot of parents are nervous to talk about these topics, or they want to and they just don't know how. So then they're hoping, like you said, that they can outsource the conversations and the education. And while that does happen a lot of times, I want to address both of those elements. I want to say that we see constantly in research, there has been a lot of ongoing research. Some of the most beginning studies done on sexuality education have been around parents' role. And we see again and again and again that children and teens especially want their parents to talk to them about these topics, even when it seems like they don't, even when it seems like they say like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing, or like, Eva, I know everything already. They want their parents to be relevant and to have these conversations with them. And something that a lot of parents are nervous about is that if we start having these conversations and talking about these topics with them, is going to kind of open a Pandora's box and lead them to thinking about or seeking out things that they wouldn't have beforehand. And something that we see again in studies, and I'm saying this to alleviate concerns of parents who want to be relevant and want to talk about these things with their kids, but they're worried that they're going to put ideas in their head, or that they're going to be the one to like lead them down this path of Google searches that they might not have done. Or nowadays, just so you know, all of the cool kids are using ChatGPT. Google's like for old-fashioned people now. But research shows again and again that dafka, when there is education around topics of sexuality and intimacy, it postpones experimenting. It postpones the age of experimenting. Also, kids who have relevant adults, and especially parents who talk to them about it, they engage in less dangerous behaviors. So they'll be seeking out less information that we wouldn't want them to see. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if teens, especially, they become curious. It's part of a healthy natural development is to be interested and engaging in these topics. And if they don't get the information from a trusted adult and a reliable source, they're going to seek it out elsewhere. So that's a really important piece is understanding that as parents, our kids want us. If we want to be able to teach them our values and to be mechanech them, right? We do trust schools and teachers to do a lot of the educational work for our kids. But as parents, we want to impart with our kids our values in life in general. And around such an important and central topic such as sexuality, we also should think, what are the values? What is the education we want to transmit to our kids and to be the ones to teach them? Because if we don't, it's not that they're going to exist in a vacuum. If we don't teach them our values, if we don't talk about it, they're going to be learning about it from other places. And it won't always be from their school and from other reliable sources and trusted adults. So the impetus really, really is on parents to get with it and to figure out what they need to feel comfortable being the trusted adult and the reliable source to have these conversations with their kids.
Yonina, first of all, I'm really thrilled to have you on our podcast. It's very refreshing to hear you speak. And I'm hoping that most of our listeners are convinced already by what you're saying. And I remember a saying, if you know, then you can say no. In other words, that having the information really empowers you to be able to choose your behaviors and choose where you go to learn more things and put boundaries and learn about consent. In fact, there have been studies that indicate that the more sexual education is provided in, again, a values-based and intentional way, the less out of control sexual behaviors. As a matter of fact, I remember, you won't remember this, but was it the Bush administration when they started doing like abstinence-only sex education? And there were more pregnancies. Anyway, so we're convinced it's important. And what I'd like to ask about really is, what do we talk about when we talk about sexuality and sex? Because people think that it's about the act, and there's so much more. And the truth is that I'm sure that children have a lot of curiosity about that as well. But I think there's so many aspects. There is the kind of cognitive educational aspect, which is having information about the act of sex and about what it is and the biology and the reproduction and all that stuff. But I think there's a lot more than that, which is about the healthy development of a sexual sense of self, which includes having a healthy body awareness and a healthy sensory enjoyment and so many other aspects. So I'd like to use this opportunity, since you do this, you speak to parents, for you to give us a little bit of background on what are the topics and maybe some of the tips so that people listening can have some practical tools.
Okay, so I really agree with what you're saying. I want to add that when I say I'm a sexuality educator, people think that I teach, they think, oh, so you're like a college teacher. They think I teach, adults. And when they hear I go into high schools and even middle schools and sometimes fifth and sixth grade, they're shocked. They're like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? It's so inappropriate. And what I usually start almost all lectures and workshops is by defining what I mean when I say sexuality. And sexuality really, like you said, isn't just about how to have sex. I define it on the tip of the iceberg. There are some really long and very definitive definitions, but on the tip of the iceberg, I define sexuality as everything having to do with bodies and relationships. And so if we think about it in that, if we reframe it that way, then it's understandable why parents can be teaching their kids healthy sexuality from age 0. And not just can, but they are. Whether we're aware of it or whether we're not, we are teaching our children about sexuality all the time. If we're talking about bodies and relationships, then the way we treat our body in our house, right? Do we force our kids to take a bath, right? If my 3-year-old says, I don't want to take a bath, do I say, too bad, you have to, you're stinky, you're dirty, or you're gross right now, you have to take a bath? Or do we say, oh, I hear that, and we can talk about this in a few minutes about how we create a culture of consent in a way that is actually livable. when we change, I bring this example a lot. When we change our baby's diaper, do we say, "Oh my gosh, this is so disgusting, so stinky"? Do we fight about like who changes the diaper? Do we say, "Wow, your body's working. You made such a great poop"? Okay, so you don't always have to celebrate all of the more nitty-gritty parts of bodies, but the point is that we're teaching our kids in the way that we talk about things, and the way that we experience them, and the way that we talk about our body. When we are getting ready, and I'm always around Chagim. People are on diets or summer's coming up. So do kids experience their mother as being really worried that it's getting to be summer and she's going to wear a bathing suit and she's going on a diet and all of a sudden she's not eating as much and she's, talking about it a lot? And when they hear their mother talking to their friends, is that a topic that comes up a lot? Or does their mother, have a different kind of relationship with food and bodies, and that's what they're picking up? That's what the atmosphere in their home is. So that's in relation to when we're talking about sexuality education, that's what we're talking about. We're not just talking about how to teach our kids about sex or where babies come from, because that's a lot of times parents come to me and say, how do I teach? Okay, my daughter is 12. I have to have the talk. How do we have the talk? And so this ties into like the second part of your question of how we do it. What do we talk about at what stage? Are there things that are inappropriate to raise at different stages? And also, I don't know if you want to address this, Scott, but like the whole topic bichlal that people say to me sometimes is there's a reason that in frum communities we have chassan and kala teachers. That is the stage of life when it's appropriate to talk about these things. Beforehand, it's not appropriate. I don't want, it could be my daughter's being exposed from other places to inappropriate things, but at least she knows that's what other people are saying, and that it's not matim, it's not part of a religious life for us to be talking about that with our younger kids.
So my feeling is that is a mistaken attitude, this idea that somehow it's inappropriate for a parent to talk about these things with their children. That's why we have chatan and kala teachers. We certainly need to have chatan and kala teachers. And I'm not saying that a parent should necessarily talk about the intimate details of their own sex lives. I think that would be inappropriate. There's a very big difference, however, between the tzniut of keeping a spouse's relationship with his or her spouse private vis-a-vis their kids in terms of what they do in the bedroom versus not talking about it at all and not being able to have these conversations. I think people often point to the Mishnah in the second parak of Chagiga, which talks about not discussing arayot in a certain group, forbidden sexual relationships, as if that means you can't talk about these things at all. Let's face the fact. Anyone who goes to a Daf Yomi Shir and learns Masechet Nida and learns Masechet Yevamot and many more is talking about this all the time. There's a difference between talking about intimate sexual relations between a particular couple and talking about the laws and concepts and values and ethics of sex. I think it's very important to speak with not only with students, but also with children. And just to say in terms of this particular issue, kids nowadays are exposed to so much. It's almost like the equivalent of Hillel's Imloch Shavei Matai. If you're not going to do it, then who else is going to do it? So I think parents have that obligation to do it. And if not, they're the ones who are going to be very sorry later on. And I don't think it's any violation of tzniut. In fact, it's a dereliction of duty not to have conversations if they're necessary, and they usually are.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that I see when people come to chassan and kala teachers, and Talli, I'm sure you see this in your clinic also, if they haven't had any other conversations within their value system. And this is why I think it's so important that it comes from parents, it comes from the home, it comes from teachers, it comes from Jewish looking or Jewish values based sources. Is there this creation of kind of like a disconnect of like, okay, I know what sex is, I know what sexuality is, I know what that looks like in the world. Like a girl once in 8th grade, I think, wrote to me at the end of workshops. I let them write like anonymous notes and then I answer them. So she wrote, I know how not Jewish people have babies, but how do Jewish people have babies, right? Because she had that disconnect of like, okay, well, that's what happens there, but now like, how do actually like from people like what does that look like? And so I see when people come to I work with women, so I see with college teachers is that again they don't come a blank slate, and then to start like unlearning and relearning when they already have been consuming hundreds of thousands of hours of Netflix and conversation and songs and culture, but they don't have the Jewish perspective on it or values-based perspective on it. It really can create a lot of issues once married.
Yonina, I'd like to ask about something specific that you said a few minutes ago. You talked about kids in the bath and using that perhaps as an opening to discuss consent. I think consent is on the whole, a relatively easy topic for parents, perhaps more so than some of the others we might be talking about. Let's start with that one. How would you say you open a conversation with your kids about consent and bodily autonomy?
It ties into what Talli was asking before. Consent dafka isn't such an easy one, and I'll tell you why. We all agree that consent is an important value in a relationship, but a lot of times parents feel that their children don't actually have a space for consent at younger ages, meaning there's this kind of expectation that when our kids enter a romantic relationship, they will learn about giving and taking consent or asking for consent, but it's something that happens with older kids. And when we're talking about sexuality education, it really starts from creating a culture at home. It's nonverbal. Even before we talk about specific topics, we are exemplifying them, we are modeling them, and we are creating a culture in which that is the expected behavior. So I'm not going to say to my Actually, I will say to my nonverbal baby, right? She's half a year old or 10 months old. I might say to her, hey, can I change your diaper now? Now, I'm not going to wait for her to answer, right? But I'm creating a culture in which it's obvious that when we are going to touch someone else's body or do something to someone else's body, we check in with them. So my older kids might hear me saying that, and it's something that they absorb. And it also becomes normal for me to talk about with my kid as they're growing up. Because if we try and just start creating a culture or a language, a family language, when our kids are 10, 12, 15, it's going to feel very stilted and very weird, right? If we just start saying to our 15-year-old, hey, can I give you a hug? Or it won't be part of our culture. And then they'll say, I don't want a hug. I do want a hug. And they don't know how to handle it. So when we start from a young age modeling consent, it's something that they pick up on. Now, the tricky part with consent and young kids is that really, when kids are very young, they don't have as much body autonomy. And we are teaching them how to handle body autonomy, but really as parents, we're still mainly in charge of their body autonomy and the care and keeping of their body. And part of our job as parents is to transfer over that autonomy, that control that they have over their body, and teaching them how to care for their body. Right? So an example with an older, so consent is tricky a lot with younger kids because parents will say to me, my kid doesn't want to brush their teeth. It will have negative impact on their health when they're older if as a 2-year-old they're not brushing their teeth. So what can I do? I don't want to force them. I don't want to teach them that I can force them to do something to their body that they don't want to. On the one hand, on the other hand, I'm in charge right now of taking care of their body. So how do I handle that? How do I balance that? And so there are lots of different techniques that we can use. A lot of them go into just general parenting things, like you can turn it into a game with little kids, or you can give them choices. Do you want to brush your teeth in the living room or on the couch, or do you want to watch a movie? There are different ways to navigate it, but it's important to know that it's not all or nothing, right? And then there are things as kids get older and older, and this is something we see a lot, is that when kids are younger, the part that is easier about teaching them, Talli, like you said, creating a body awareness and creating a culture of body empowerment. Dafka, when kids are younger, they have a lot more space for physical exploration and for sensuality, right? They go to parks, they play in the sandbox. We say to them, oh, does that feel good? There's a lot of touch. There's a lot. Little kids are very physical, and there's a lot of sensuality involved in raising them. As they get older, and we see this like very clear cut that starts in first grade, we say, great, GAN was fun, kindergarten was fun, you had a lot of time for exploring and touching and squishing and playing. Now you need to sit your body down in a chair and you can't move it, even if you need to go to the bathroom, even if you're hungry. You need to override, you need to tame your body, you need to tame your desires, and you need to fit it into the culturally appropriate context or mold that we've created. And it just gets worse and worse from there. Now, I say worse and worse, kind of like people listen to the podcast won't see. I say it with like a wink. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm not saying that we need to keep on letting, kids and humans just roam free and fulfill their heart's desires at every moment. It is important to have cultural norms and rules of how we behave with our body, to teach ourselves that we can't always fulfill. It's an important part of healthy sexuality, is to learn control and ipuk and restraint, that we can't always do whatever we want. But something happens a lot of times is that we end up teaching our kids to outsource their bodily knowing. And so it happens, for example, a great example is when the weather changes and we say to our kid, you need to take a coat. It's cold outside. And they say, no, I'm not cold, right? It could be they're 5, it could be they're 15. I'm not cold. I don't want a coat. And you say, it's raining. What are you, crazy? You need to take a coat. It's snowing. Like, those are the rules of the world, is when it snows, a person has to wear a coat. Like, your body gets cold. And so do we force them, or do we find a way to allow them to experiment and learn on their own? Or do we have a compromise? Can we collaborate with them? Right? Like a funny, I don't know if it's a saying or if it's a joke, where someone says, it's well, I'm cold looking at you, so put on a sweater, right? So sometimes, like, it's a Jewish mother thing. It's like, I'm wearing this sweater because my mother's cold. But at the root of it, some of what we might be teaching our kids is, I know better about your body than you. Someone else knows better about your body than you. And then what we see sometimes when people reach adulthood is that they're still looking for other people to tell them about their body instead of trusting their own sense and knowing about their body. We see it a lot when people know that they feel like something is off and they go to doctor after doctor and the doctor says nothing's wrong, and then they end up finding out it is. Or even the sense that I can't trust my feelings. I can't trust what I know about my body. So we need someone else to tell us.
I like where this conversation is going very much, because it has a very psychosocial element to it, elements of psychology and systemic family dynamics, as well as what the society and the culture that you're in believes about bodily autonomy. And traditional cultures, there's a lot less bodily autonomy. And as we get into more Western and modern cultures, there's a lot more emphasis on that. And we see that really throughout the spectrum, which I'd like to comment on. But I just want to make the observation that you're, in essence, doing parenting courses in a way. You're really teaching about concepts of validating. You didn't say the word, but that's actually what you're doing, is providing an alternative and saying, okay, what are you feeling? Oh, wow, you're not cold. You're really warm-blooded, but I think you should take the coat just in case. You might get cold later. And validating not only sensations, but also validating feelings. As you build what you were talking about in Freudian terms is the ego. It's the balance between the id, the I want, that primitive desire to feel good, and the superego, which is the morals and the values and the, you shouldn't do that and that's not right. And we're constantly balancing that, especially when we're raising children, because we can't rely on their developed self to make the right decisions for them. And so we need to be building both those parts. We need to be building the voice of restraint, so to speak, as well as acknowledging and encouraging and validating what feels good, what's nice, what's your preference? Do you want to wear the blue dress today or the red dress today? Where you can give autonomy. And if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, unfortunately, we have abuse and narcissistic kind of ownership of the child, where the child is used for the adult's needs, whether it's anxiety reduction or pleasure or whatever it is. And in that case, obviously, there's going to be, I would say, a very, very negative and harmful and destructive influence on the development of the self, certainly, and certainly sexually. Okay, so now I can go to my question. I'm going to take a minute to point out that our first 3 episodes of Intimate Judaism in our very first season would be good to kind of refresh at this point. The second and third episode were how to raise sexually healthy Orthodox girls, and then the next one was boys, and we touched a lot on these topics. So I really appreciate having a specific episode about how you do that. And now to the question. Intimate Judaism is really all about conflict. We do talk about values, and here we're talking about values-based, Torah values-based sex education. And yet, as a sex educator, I'm sure you've confronted times where it seems that the basic values of sexual health come in conflict with certain restrictions. I'm specifically talking about self-pleasure masturbation for boys and for girls, which really is like one of those very pre-verbal even kind of messages of this is my body and it feels good and I'm not harming myself. So, let me kind of thing. And that gets disrupted, and it gets disrupted either in a very kind of negative way even early in life. In some Hasidic communities, they'll even develop garments to keep hands away or say, don't sleep on your stomach or whatever, like very, very intense. And then I would also talk about being shomer negia, which is also when you're building relationships, and relationships is obviously a very important part of sex education, is how to develop even same-sex relationships with the intimacy skills of validation and empathy and repair of conflict and all that. And that's part of, I'm sure, the education. But also wanting to touch is part of that. It's very natural. I was wondering if you could comment on how you approach those subjects when you speak to parents about speaking to their children.
Let me just make one parenthetical comment, just one sentence before you go on, Yonina. That idea of not sleeping on your stomach or not sleeping on your back is not only in extreme Hasidic communities, it's actually in standard halacha books as well for anyone who's Orthodox. So,
Shasani Kirtsono, that's all I have to say.
I want to address the idea of the conflict, and then I'll touch on the topics that you brought up. The fact that there is conflict between a desire to express our sexuality in certain ways and our religious framework, our values-based framework. And I say values-based because people express their Jewish values and they keep the Jewish law in different ways. But at the end, and even people who, this is something that I find is really important to say when I teach teens, is I say even people, or even if you have a friend, or even if there's a period of life when you aren't keeping certain halachot, you still need to think about what your boundaries are and what your values are. Because like we said before, a big part of healthy sexuality is also learning how to practice restraint. And sometimes that is a piece that gets missed, is that when we want to teach our children our values and we want to be mechanech them and teach them in our ways and educate them to be, keeping halacha and keeping Torah and living a Torah-based lifestyle. So a lot of times we're going to educate them through the lens of halacha and we teach them the halachic framework. But then they don't always know what to do when they're in situations when they're not necessarily keeping certain halachot. For example, shmirat negia. I work a lot with youth at risk, and a lot of girls who come from very religious backgrounds say to me that they went through a period where they say, "Ishtagati," like I went crazy, I went totally off the rails, to the point where my non-religious friends said to me, like, "Whoa, where's your self-respect? Like, you don't even understand that there's a concept of boundaries unrelated to halacha." So like if you're not shomer negia, that doesn't mean that you can, you can do whatever, you want, but that it's appropriate. It's not either keep shomer negia or, okay, now I'm sleeping with my boyfriend. There's a whole scale in between there. So that's just something that connected that I wanted
the
to.
opposite of shomer is hefker. I think we said that on one of our episodes once.
Right. So to teach them how to think about, like we're talking about, like consent and boundaries and a healthy relationship, what a healthy relationship looks like, what touch looks like within the framework of a healthy relationship. But I want to go back to the original question about the conflict. So we see that there is conflict, and there's a really awesome study which I can send you guys to link in the podcast notes. It was done in Canada, and they asked college students who grew up religious, mainly not Jewish, when they grew up in different kinds of other religions, how they handled that conflict when they were teens, how they handled that conflict between their exploring their sexuality, between going through this period of intense learning about your sexuality and their religion. And there were three main themes which arose. One was people who abandoned their religion. They said, there's too much of a conflict here. I can't handle the conflict. So, and we know this a lot, and we see this a lot in the frum world. People go off the derech because of conflicts that are grounded in sexuality. Another was they rounded corners. They said, like, you know what? I'm masturbating. Hashem loves me anyway. It's too hard for me to keep this halacha, or it's shomer negia wasn't meant for our modern day and age. It was meant for a time when people got married when they were young. I'm not keeping that halacha. It's too much for me. And the third were people who found comfort in religion. They were able to say, even though this is really hard for me, and I don't necessarily always manage to keep to my values, I don't always manage to keep shomer negia, to just sneeze according to the halachot as I understand it, to be shomer negia, to not masturbate, I still hold those as things that are dear to me. I'm still striving towards them, and I know that it's on a process. I'm on a journey. Avodat Hashem is something that is, there's a process to it, there's movement to it, and I won't always be able to keep everything. And I know that I can still have a relationship with Hashem and still be part of the religious world, and I don't have to choose. I'm going to say something about that in a minute. A fourth thing, which wasn't mentioned in this study, but I see when I work with religious women, Jewish women, is, so we talked about abandoning religion. I see women who abandon their sexuality. So I see women who come to me after they're married and they said, I was such a good girl. I kept everything. I always volunteered and I was tsanua. And I just disconnected from my body. Like they didn't have a body sense. They weren't aware of their desires. It wasn't a big deal for them. And they abandoned that. And now when they're married, and all of a sudden it's a mitzvah and it's part of their religious values to be in touch with their sexual beings, and their husband wants them to enjoy it and to do, to discover themselves. They're like, wait a minute, what happened here? I lost that part of myself.
Yeah, there are men that do that too.
Right. So I meet the women. And I'm sure the same thing happens with men.
The third position from the study, it reminds me of another study that we talked about on one of our podcasts that Kobe Francis did on older single men and the way that they approached premarital sex. Also kind of like a split position, I'm doing the best I can position, and then a more integrated position. I love Hashem, I love this side of me, I love being a spiritual person, but I also am a sexual person, and I need to integrate that. So I think that kind of parallels that
right. And so the
integration.
third thing, and there's another study with same-sex attraction that has also similar outcome. But what was interesting is that the third position was the least applied as people self-reported as teens. And something that Maor Kaplan, who's someone I learned from a lot, a colleague who's also a teacher and a friend, what she says is that in order to, well, first of all, before that, the reason that it's least applied is because it's the most complex.
Just to clarify, that's the position where I'm not negating religion and I'm not negating this particular halacha. I'm saying I know that shomer negia is a value, and I acknowledge that sometimes I don't do it, even though I say it's still a good thing to do.
Right. Shomer negia is a halacha. I value keeping halacha. I want to one day be able to, or I strive at some, I'm still in conversation with shomer negia. I'm not saying I'm not doing it because it's too hard. But right now, I know I'm in a struggle with it.
I think we have to acknowledge that the integrated position requires maturity and all your synapses connecting.
B'diuk. So that's the part that which is most complex because it requires holding the complexity of two conflicting truths at the same time. And that's something which is very hard to do in general in life, and especially with teens, and especially when we're talking about sexuality, which is something which is so basic. And if we want to think about how we can help our teens be there, where they don't have to abandon a part of themselves, where they can really integrate and live as fully aligned, there are a few things that we can do to help them, right? So one is that we can teach them the skill of holding two conflicting truths at the same time from a young age, meaning we can teach them. I was looking through some notes I wrote down, like, cute things that my kids said. And I was looking through them recently. And one of my kids, for their third or fourth birthday party, I said, are you excited for your party in Gan tomorrow? And they said, I'm really excited. And I'm also really nervous. I'm scared that the kids are going to make fun of me because I'm so excited. And I feel like I want to cry, but I also want to dance. And I was like, wow, that's such a beautiful example of her being able to feel conflicting or a bunch of different feelings at the same time, and to be able to hold all of that. So we can teach them that skill in other areas of life as well. We can also model for them. We can talk about, I know Rabbi Scott, you talked about like how we don't want to give away, we don't want to talk about our personal intimate things. We don't have to say, oh, I remember as a teen how hard it was for me not to masturbate. We don't have to say that, but we can talk about how it's something that everyone struggles with. We can talk about how, yeah, there are some halacha that are really hard to keep. And sometimes I don't manage to be at the level of observance that I would always want to. But it doesn't mean that I have to throw everything out of the window or that Hashem doesn't love me. This is something I hear from my colleagues who work with the boys, with teen boys, a lot of times where they feel like they're living a dual personality. They say, like, on the outside, everyone thinks I'm this great guy. They don't know what I really do in my personal life. So to be able to also say, no, we're all holding that conflict in different ways.
And an important point I think that has to be mentioned as well is, particularly when it comes to issues of intimacy and sex, I have seen so many people who assume I'm the only one.
Mm-hmm.
No one who speaks Lashon Hara thinks they're the only one who speaks Lashon Hara. But kids who masturbate think they're the only kid who masturbates, and they feel terribly guilty because of that. At the same time, though, Yonina, I'm wondering, on behalf of parents, how do you raise it? How do you start that conversation? And what words do you use? How explicit are you? Again, you're not going to talk about, as you said, your own personal intimate life, but if you start saying there are things we should talk about, you talk around the subject, it might miss the point. So can you actually sort of model how to do this a little bit in a more direct way?
Yeah. So the topic of masturbation.
For example, yeah, let's
Okay.
do that.
That I want to just frame for the listeners that when we're talking about talking to our kids about sexuality, about sexual education, like we started off by saying, there's creating a culture in the home, which we touched upon a bunch of different ways you can do that, a bunch of important components. And then there's also like the giving over of the information itself. And a lot of times parents start with the giving over of the information itself. Meaning they'll say, okay, I know I need to have a conversation about masturbation, about puberty and about how babies are born. What do I say? And sometimes we get very hung up on the words. What do I say? How do I say it? What's age appropriate? Which is really like the tip of the iceberg, mibchinati. The more basic and foundational work that we need to do first is, first of all, reflecting for ourselves as parents on what we are transmitting non-verbally to our kids, right? Because even if a parent sits down and says, your body is amazing and Hashem gave us, you know, the ability to feel pleasure, but they're clenching inside and you can barely get the words out, the kid is going to pick up on that energy, okay? And then there's creating the next level of in the pyramid would be creating experiences, physical experiences, like how do we experience our body? Because again, if we say our body is so amazing, but we don't really do anything as a family, where we don't touch, we don't go on walks together, we don't enjoy eating ice cream, and there's like no physicality, then also it's like, okay, what are you talking about? And then we also need to get clear as parents, and it sounds like a lot of homework, but I'm telling you, whoever's listening to this, you're doing a lot of this already. Great, you're doing it. Amazing. If you're listening to this podcast, you're already so much there. Okay. Is also think about what our values are and what information we want to give over to our kid. If we want it to be biological, if we want it to be halacha, if we want a combination. And then the words are going to be an outcome of that process. And they're also going to land on our kids much more naturally, and they're going to be able to be accepted and heard if we have those foundations. Okay. So for example, masturbation. So I'm a big proponent of what I call the spiral approach to talking to kids about these topics, which means that we start at a very young age. We plant seeds, or we start at the spiral, and we keep on coming back to these topics again and again as they get older and older, and adding on more and more information. Because if the first time a parent talks to their teen about masturbation is at age 15, it can be very challenging, because I have to ask, well, what do they already know? And what do they know from their friends? What do they know from a family? What conversations have you had? What experiences have they had? But if we start, so I'm going to give an example of how we can start talking about it from a young age. And then if there are parents who are listening who haven't and want to start at an older age, how you can do that even without the beginning of the spiral. So from a very young age, first of all, from masturbation specifically, we know that it's something that babies even do in utero. It's a very natural tendency. Our genitals have a lot of nerve endings. They're very pleasurable area to touch. When there are young kids, even, they will be seeking out to explore their genitals and to be touching their private parts. So we can start having these conversations from a very young age in a very simple way. When our kids are really little and it's socially appropriate for them to maybe be sticking their hand in their diaper, we could, right, when they're 1-2 years old, we could say, oh, does it feel good to be touching your private parts? Or are you curious what's in your diaper? Do you want me to take your diaper off for you? Right? We can give them permission to explore. They're not doing it from an erotic perspective in the sense of adult erotica, right? And this is a really important understanding of the difference between childhood sexuality and mature sexuality. Children until age, it depends on each kid, but right, definitely before age 8, they're not being driven hormonally by desire or by passion. They're being drawn by curiosity, by pleasure, by sensuality.
And by soothing. It's
And
soothing.
Right. So it's a very sensual and emotional space. It's not passionate. So when they're young, we can just give them permission and help them celebrate their body and give them words to what they're feeling, words to the experience. Once they're a little bit older and it's not socially acceptable, right? So when they're already 3, 4, maybe in some families even younger, when they're 2, it's not appropriate. Then we can say to them, I like a very, very simple rule, private parts and private places. And we can say it in a very celebratory or happy way, right? We can say, As a Kef, I'm so happy that you are, seeing what feels good on your body, or I'm so happy that you found out that Hashem made our private parts sensitive to touch, or that it feels good or it feels ticklish. Because the private parts, we only touch them in private places. Where do you think could be a private place in our house? Right? Do you want to go continue in your room, in the bathtub? It's not appropriate in the living room because the living room isn't a private place. We can also, before we even tell them, we can ask them. We can say, "Oh, I see you have your hands in your pants. Are you touching your private parts? Does that feel good? Is it itchy? Like, what's going on? Tell me about it." It could be they have worms and they're trying to scratch their tush, right? It could be that they have a rash if they're young kids. So also, this goes back to making them the expert on their body, right? What's going on? I see you're touching a private place. Is everything okay? Does it feel good? Is something bothering you? Maybe their underwear is too tight. And then if we check in and like, oh no, it just feels good, or it's ticklish, or I saw my friend do it, then we can know how we want to address the situation. If it feels good and they're just touching for pleasure, for soothing, then we can say, awesome, private parts and private places. Do you want to go to a private place, or do you want to stop for now? What happens oftentimes for parents, though, is that they see something which they interpret as being a sexual behavior. They might be looking at it through an adult lens of like, oh my God, my kid is masturbating. It's asur. And then they freak out. Like you said, Talli, a lot of what I teach parents is basically parenting skills, but applied to sexual situations. Because sometimes what happens is we have the skills and we know all the parenting stuff, but then when it comes to sexual things, like there's a block there. Like we're not able to do the transfer because like sex is something like, ugh. So the first thing really is I would tell parents, take a deep breath, right? And be like, okay, just soothe yourself, regulate yourself before you address the situation. And then when kids get on, so that's like the beginning of the spiral is our kids know until age 5, 6, they'll know that touching our private parts could feel good. Hashem made our bodies that way. It's awesome. They'll know the names of their genitals. I remember once one of my kids was exploring their body and they said, "What's this?" And I was like, "Well, that's your clitoris." I'm like, "Well, what does this do?" I'm like, "Oh, that's for feeling good." Okay, so it could be like for us, like, how do I answer? And also, I want to say that it's okay for us to mess up and to correct. Okay, so if a parent's listening and you did say to your kid, "Oh my gosh, stop doing that. That's gross, or it's not sneeze, or that's inappropriate," you can say, "Hey, remember a few weeks ago when you were, I saw you with your hand, we were watching TV together and your hand was in your skirt and I said that's not sanua. I was thinking about it. It's appropriate. It's fine for you to touch your own, body and private parts, but in a private place." And I was just kind of taken aback because I didn't know how to respond. So I'm sorry if I made you feel embarrassed. That's also creating a culture and modeling of being able to apologize and to correct.
Can I just double up on that and say how important that is? I've seen it's something that's been coming up a lot in certain conversations that I've been having. Parents who make mistakes means every single parent. The ability to say, wow, I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't have said that. What I really think is this. I was just caught unawares, or I made a mistake in saying it like that. I know that isn't really our topic, but I just want to say how important I believe that is, because that in some ways takes what was originally a negative interaction and makes it doubly positive. Because aside from correcting the issue, you're demonstrating that parents make mistakes too, and it's okay to correct yourself, and you don't have to be stuck and hold your heels down and say, I can't change anything.
And it is our topic. I even wrote this down as one of the things to talk about is make mistakes. Because when our teens or our kids, right, and this also ties into another tool called priming, but if our kids make a mistake and they watch a movie that they know is inappropriate, or they did something with a friend that they know was inappropriate, or they went along with something that they know that they shouldn't have, we want them to be raised in a house where they can come to, I made a mistake. And they know that they can say that and that we can accept that and we can, and it's not the end of the world and we're not going to judge them or, so it's definitely, yeah, on topic.
Okay, Yonina, can you talk about what you alluded to earlier? Let's say a parent has not done what you've suggested, and they have not talked about, in our example, masturbation, and now their child's a teenager. So, okay, unfortunately, they did not do what you suggested, but all is not lost, I assume. What does one do now?
Awesome. So, like we said, that there's a difference between childhood sexuality and mature sexuality. Even parents who talked to their kids about masturbation when they were younger need to continue talking about it with them as they get older, or come back to revisit the conversation when their kids are hitting puberty, going through puberty. And it could be, it'll be your first conversation, and then it might, be a little bit, you need to add in a little bit more of a foundation there. It could be, it'll be really built on the past. And I do want to say that in studies that I have seen, there isn't a correlation between kids who masturbated as children and masturbate as teens, meaning there are kids who every night masturbated to soothe themselves to sleep. And as they hit puberty, it faded out and they don't necessarily revisit. And the opposite, there are kids who didn't masturbate as kids, and it's something that they do become familiar with as teens. So I want to say that to allay the fears, sometimes parents say to me, okay, well, I can be positive about it when they're kids, but then I'm going to need to tell them when they're 10 or 12 that they need to stop doing this thing, which I framed so positively. So how do I handle that? So I want to say that oftentimes it just shifts on its own as kids mature and their sexuality changes. So how would you address it if it's the first time having conversation? So first of all, I wouldn't recommend it being the first conversation in a series of puberty and sexuality conversations. And this is a shift in mindset between having the talk and between talking about healthy sexuality, right? A lot of times parents, we grew up with this concept of having the talk, which is like at a certain age, right? For Jewish people, a lot of times around bar and bat mitzvah, parents start thinking about having the talk, and they feel that they need to teach their kids about how babies are made. So basically, reproduction and sex, and then maybe they'll touch upon masturbation, usually for boys if it's a more traditional framework. But what we see as more effective meaning that the teens actually are able to absorb the information, and more effective in the sense that it creates a relationship and the parent is an address for teens to turn to with questions and issues that arise, is not having one talk, but having a series of ongoing conversations. And so if we're talking about masturbation, I would not recommend it being the first conversation, especially if there haven't been conversations before, but starting with talking about puberty and our changing body and how the body changes, and also inside things change. And we can talk about hormones and sexual desire and arousal. And as part of that, to explain to teens that they'll feel that desire and arousal, this wanting to touch, this wanting to get close, this feeling of maybe tingly or tickly. Different teens experience it differently, and they might feel it more in their private parts. And I'm not saying the word specifically because it also depends on how you talk about it in your family. And sometimes when they feel that sensation in those parts of their body, they might feel like wanting also to touch them. And that touch might be called, they might have heard this word, and here you can also use a technique called making them the expert. You might have heard of this. It's called, or I'm gonna like simulate a conversation. You might have heard of this. It's called masturbation or onenut or self-pleasure. I don't know. Have you have one of your friends mentioned that? Have you heard about it in a TV show once? And then if they say so, you say, okay, well, what did you hear about that? Or can you tell me about it a little bit? What have your friends been saying? And I know it's something that sometimes people talk about a lot. Sometimes people don't talk about it. What's going on with you? And then from there, we can start adding on little bits of information. But it's important. Sometimes as parents, we're like, this is going so well, we want to do more and more. And we end up sometimes doing like an overload. So I recommend having like shorter conversations with like 1 or 2 points. If you want to like be proactive and think about, okay, I want to talk today about this, 1 or 2 points, think about how I'm going to say it, and then say, okay, this is a great talk. If you have questions, I'll go follow up with you in a week or so. So that's one way to do it. Another way is what I call using connecting to opportunities. Like I said, that sexuality education is ongoing. We're always doing it. If we look around us, there are always opportunities to talk about these topics. So it could be, we'll be listening to a song where, I don't know, we're shopping and in the supermarket, there's like a song which uses a slang word about masturbation, or we're driving and on the radio it comes up, or you might specifically choose to put on a song with words like that. Or I remember once when I was younger, I don't know why, we had like the soundtrack of Grease, the movie, playing in our house. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so inappropriate. And she was like, what are you talking about? And through this song, we had this whole conversation about like what they mean by those different phrases. So using opportunities that come up can be a great way to open the conversation. And I'll say something that is very underlooked, I think, is learning Torah together, is a wonderful way to open these conversations, especially if it's part of our family culture and it connects to what we were talking about of like values and using a language that's comfortable for us. So much Mishnah and Gemara and like in the Torah itself talks about masturbation. So let's have a chavrusa. Say, you know what? We're having bar mitzvah chavrusa. Like, let's learn this topic of puberty through the sources. Those are some ways I would bring it up with older kids, especially if we haven't started the conversation before.
So you're beginning to touch on this, I think, and that is the integration. And so I guess as I'm hearing you speak, and you're speaking with so much positivity about sexuality and self-touch, and I'm also thinking, and I'm asking this as a listener, because I think that many of the parents listening to this are thinking this question. How do you balance that? How do you integrate what you're saying about it being such a positive thing with the messages that are pretty overt about masturbation being prohibited? And I'm sure that we need a whole other podcast for the answer to that. I'm very mindful of the time, but I think we would be remiss if we did not ask for a few minutes on the topic of pornography. And I also wanted to know how you talk about porn and differentiate that from masturbation.
Okay, so you brought up a lot of things here. I want to say a few things on that. First of all, masturbation, the conversation halachically is very different for boys and girls. And I also want to say that sometimes we do to masturbation in the frum world what for boys what we do with tznius to girls, which is make it like the whole story of their sexuality or of their tznius. And that's part of the sexuality education in my eyes of masturbation for boys is to put it in proportion and to remember that there are hundreds of other topics to talk about with them to teach them healthy sexuality aside from masturbation. And when we end up putting so much focus just on that topic, it's a big disservice to them.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I really, really agree with that. I love that answer.
Look, I could talk about it a lot. It depends on how you understand the Isur of Zera Levatala. It depends who you hold by halachically. It depends how you view sexuality. I've heard several rabbanim, I'm not going to mention their names now. If you want afterwards, I'll send you the sources and you can add them to the notes, talk about the fact that and I think you have episodes on that. It's not, but if it's the banana doraita and that the chumrata isur, like the severity of it has been wildly blown out of proportion nowadays, and to just really help teen boys kind of help them put that in proportion and to learn how to have a lot of grace and self-love. And I think it goes back to balancing that conflict of two things can be true at once. Yes, it is very normal and common for teenage boys to masturbate. Yes, there are halachic things that are forbidden in regards to that. And we to be able to hold that and to know that we won't always be able to, just like Shabbat. I personally know that I do not keep all of Hilchot Shabbat the way I should be keeping them. And I still every week prepare and keep Shabbat and feel like a really great Jew, even though I know that. And just yesterday I spoke Lashon Hara. Mamash, like literally, my friend said, "Wow, you want to hear something juicy?" And I said, "Yes." And I was like, "Wow, this is a big no-no." So, like, again, we were able to do that in a lot of areas in our life, and then when it comes to sex, we kind of like, "Oh wait, this is like a different topic. This is like that disconnect of like, we're not transferring the same way we approach our Judaism in general to this area of our life. It's like the same. It's the same rules, even though sex is." A lot of it stems from the fact that we don't talk about it so much. So it stays kind of in the dark and we're not sure how and where and what. So that's what I'm going to say in that regard. And masturbation for girls, another topic. Like,
let me just refer people who are listening right now. It happens to be that we released a rerun about 2 weeks ago, our interview with Oriam Vorak about girls and masturbation. So it's probably worthwhile listening to that episode too.
And then what you asked about porn, porn is a very, very big topic. It brings up for me to mention that when we talk about teaching our kids healthy sexuality, there are things that are much easier for us to talk about. And it could be for each parent, they'll be different. But a lot of times the more positive things, like to talk about puberty and self-love and development, like biological things, a lot of times are easier because like they're much more grounded. And there are things which we call like the challenges, the parts where it's more complicated, and us as adults and as parents might also be challenged and struggling, which are much more complicated and harder for us to talk about. So there are things like shomer negia, right? How we talk about the complexity of it, not just yes or no. Things like porn, things like not, and also I want to say about porn, and I will talk about it as a topic in a minute, but in general, things like abuse and unhealthy relationships, the things that we're scared that our kids are going to do or be exposed to that touch upon like that inner, like that raw nerve as a parent of like, what if that's my kid? And then we come to it with a lot more fear, and it becomes a lot more challenging for us to talk about it like openly and calmly and non-judgmentally with our kids, right? And if our kid shares with us something like that happened to them or they did something like that, then it also brings up a lot for us and we don't always know how to respond, right? If our kid tells us, I got my period, so it could be like, oh my gosh, that's so exciting, right? If it's easier for us to be there than when our kid would come maybe and say, I've been watching porn, it's been getting out of control, I don't know how to do, please help me. So I want to say three things about that, like on the tip of the iceberg, not get into it as a whole thing. So one, with watching porn, it's important to know that when I talk about it with teens, I don't say watching porn. I talk about sexual content because there is also a subjective experience of what feels explicit or inappropriate to each person. So it could be that one kid is watching a show on Netflix and they feel like sababa, nothing doing, and another kid is watching that same show and they feel like, oh my gosh, my eyes are burning, or they feel guilty, or they have, they have dreams about it, or they feel like it's really not appropriate and it's not okay for them. Like the content there's much more explicit. So it's important to also frame the conversation not just as X-rated movies or porn, but in general to think about, and this goes kind of ties into what we were talking about of like that gradation. There's a whole spectrum between shomer negia and having sex. So there's a whole spectrum between not watching any sexual content and watching porn. Right? Nowadays, it's almost impossible to watch a movie or a TV show where there is no sexual content at all. And as kids get, even with like children shows, and then when teens start watching teenage, shows aimed at teens, it does get more explicit, and there are more references, more language, more relationships which are more sexual. So we want them to develop critical thinking skills no matter what they're watching. That is where I would start the conversation and put the focus of the conversation on. Thinking about what our values are in terms of what we're watching, feeling how I feel when I watch a show like this. Do I turn off I don't know if people watch on TVs. Do I turn off my phone? Do I close the computer feeling good? Do I feel refreshed? Do I feel like that was a nice hour of escapism, or I learned something new, or whatever? Or do I feel like overwhelmed? Do I feel like my stomach is clenching? Do I feel like I need to masturbate because there was something here which was very, sexual, and it really aroused me to that point? Am I masturbating while I'm watching certain content? Right? Because that ties into the masturbation piece also. When we bring the conversation more to values and boundaries and how I can set boundaries around things. And this is a really tricky one because a lot of times teens will say to me, I know that I'm learning things that might harm me in the future by watching the show, like about what relationships are, about what sex is. I know it's not true. I know like I'm developing this image in my mind or this expectation in my mind of what it's like. But what else am I going to watch? Or like, if I don't watch this, I'm going to be out of the loop. This is what all my friends are watching. This is what we talk about in recess. So what do I do? Or what else can I watch? Like there aren't other interesting shows or movies that don't have this. I think when we talk about it in that way, it's relevant to a lot more teens. And it also teaches them the skills that we want them to apply when they're watching porn also. That's that. The second thing about porn is that it is important to have an explicit conversation about porn. Okay, and that's what something funny that happens is a lot of times I'll start in a class, I'll say the word pornography. They'll be like, what? What's that? And I'll say porn. I'm like, oh, why didn't you say so? Like, just what that means. They don't always know what it means. Sometimes they can understand. They're like, oh, I watch something. I know that it's pornography. They don't always have a definition. There also isn't necessarily such a great definition. But setting that aside, it's important to talk to them. And this, again, ties into everyone's values. We can talk about the halachic approach to it, if it's permitted or forbidden. We can talk about the porn industry, if it's ethical, how women are treated, how men are treated, how We can talk about that. We could talk about, I'm just giving a few like pointers here, a few tips of a conversation. We can talk about how the truth, we can talk about what's portrayed, what's realistic, what's not realistic. We can talk about the fact that I love this quote. I think it's Oliver Nacho, but I'm not sure, that learning about sex from porn is like learning about driving from watching The Fast and the Furious. Okay, like, and a lot of kids end up turning to porn to fill in the gaps in their sexual education. And something that is mind-boggling to me is to consider that it could be that there are teens who have watched hundreds of hours of porn but have never even asked someone out on a date yet. Meaning it creates a very wide gap between their actual lived experiences, their emotional maturity, their communication skills, and this internal sexual world. And so that's also something we can talk about with them. And teens are much more mature and understanding than we give them credit for sometimes. But to talk about the price that we might pay for watching porn. And we can use the technique of making them the expert or thinking about it together, collaborating, not to have a lecture. If we're lecturing at them, they're going to shut down very quickly, right? So you have to find ways, and this is why the whole beginning, what we talked about of creating the culture and creating a relationship of how to talk about these things, and I'm going to give another really important tip in a second, is so important to talk about the benefit and the harms, right? What are you gaining from this, but what might you be losing? To talk about what happens when we learn about sex from porn, what's realistic, what's not, how it makes us feel about our bodies, how it might make us feel about, our sexual relationships, present and future. So there are a lot of different nuances and a lot of different areas we can go into. And a lot of times we think about just saying like, porn is bad. Don't watch porn. If I hear you're watching porn, I'm gonna limit your screen time. You're gonna lose your phone. That usually, for most kids, will not be beneficial. We want to educate them, not just punish them, not just set down the law. As they're teens, like we said, we're handing over more and more autonomy. So there's more and more autonomy of what they're watching, and we want them to understand. We want them to create for themselves a value system and to help develop the skills to be able to really put into practice those values. And so there's one tip that I want to point out about talking is a lot of times we as parents, we want to teach them how to navigate intimacy. That's a whole nother topic. Intimacy in this day and age is really an important skill to teach our kids, and we have to model and we have to create situations. But a lot of times people say, okay, we're gonna have hot cocoa, we're gonna sit down on a date, I'm gonna talk, we're gonna have a talk, we're gonna have a conversation. This is so important. I'm so great. Once kids hit puberty, that is most of the time not going to work. And this is like a big benefit of the spiral approach of starting when they're young. When kids are young, you can talk about a lot of things. They'll be curious, it'll be interesting. It's not personal to them yet. They're not hormonally going through anything. Once kids start hitting puberty and they start understanding, even if physically they're not developing, like just emotionally, internally, cognitively, things are changing, they're going to be a lot more embarrassed to have these conversations, and there's going to be more resistance. And a really great tip for having these conversations anyway is to create situations where there's no eye contact and where your hands are busy. It gives outlet for energy. Like if your hands are busy, if you're on a walk, if you're doing an arts and crafts project together, if you're cooking together, right? Oftentimes I'll call one of the kids into the kitchen to do, Shabbos prep with me, or to go shopping together. In the car is really great. Not having eye contact reduces the tension, reduces embarrassment, kind of lets us have that conversation, and having some sort of activity or a way to kind of release energy toch kedei also helps with the with focus, so we can have a little bit of a longer conversation, and also just with what to do with all that fidgetiness and energy, because we're talking about something which might be awkward.
This was great. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our listeners are enjoying this conversation. You can send in your comments, your questions. I think we might need to do a follow-up at some point based on the questions that will come in. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yonina, I second what Talli said. This was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners learned a lot as well. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Intimate Judaism. Make sure to go to intimatejudaism.com, where you can find the show notes for this and all episodes, including the links that Yonina just mentioned. We'll see you next time.
Bye.